Hello, my name is Nevin Baker, and I am here with Dr. Gulati, who is an interventional cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic and Associate Professor of Medicine. Dr. Gulati, thank you very much for being with us here today. I'd like to talk to you about the recent results of the SYMPLICITY HTN-3 study, as you're the site principal investigator at the Mayo Clinic for the study, as well as your work in the real-world registry with renal denervation. First, just because our audience may not be aware of renal denervation and the mechanism of action behind it, the theory, if you could elaborate a little bit on this technique.
Sure. I guess, sympathectomy first became interesting for hypertension back in the 30s and 40s. It was done surgically, big major procedures done really to section all the sympathetic chain from the renals to the brain, and it worked incredibly well for hypertension. I mean, too well. People will be troubled with orthostatic hypotension, but it really showed the proof of principle that sympathectomy was an excellent treatment for hypertension and the importance of the sympathetic nervous system in blood pressure control. That went away as drugs came in, but more recently there's been an interest in percutaneous denervation of the nerves that surround the renal arteries, really to try with radiofrequency ablation to damage those nerves and abolish both the afferent pathway to the brain and the efferent pathway from the brain thereafter. And there was some very interesting human data based on some preclinical data that led to the recently very well conducted SYMPLICITY 3 study in the US and Canada.
Okay. If we could ask you just to comment on the design and then the outcomes of that pivotal trial that was presented here at ACC.
Yeah, the pivotal trial was a randomized study that was single-blinded. So 550 patients were randomized, about that number, to either percutaneous renal denervation or a sham procedure. So importantly, everybody came to the cath lab, had a renal angiogram. If their renal anatomy was suitable, they were then randomized to either their denervation or to nothing. And the patient and everyone outside of the cath lab was not aware of the treatment assignment. So that was the beauty of this study. It was genuinely blinded to the patient and those who were following up the care. The inclusion criteria was those with significant and resistant hypertension, so 160 systolic, 90 diastolic on repeated measurements despite maximal doses of 3 drugs. So a truly resistant population who were single-blinded to their treatment strategy, and the endpoint was 6 months. And the findings were that there was really no difference between denervation versus sham in terms of office blood pressure control and ambulatory blood pressure control. There was actually a drop in both groups. So the control group or the placebo group got about a 12 millimeter drop in systolic blood pressure. Similarly, those who were treated got a shade more than that drop, but statistically no significant difference.
And that was a bit surprising for the cardiology community to see that no difference, given all the preclinical data that suggested perhaps a benefit, as well as the SYMPLICITY 1 and 2 studies, and then all the host of registries in the United States and in particularly in Europe showing that there was a difference. So what would you tell the interventional or the cardiology fellows out there that are watching, where do we go from here with the renal denervation as a therapy for resistant hypertension?
Yeah, I think no one knows where we truly go from here. But as you say, the majority of the interest really came from the clinical data rather than the preclinical animal data. SYMPLICITY 1 and 2, which were non-blinded treatments of patients with resistant hypertension, showed incredibly good drops in blood pressure, office blood pressure, sustained out to 2 and 3 years, and there's no drug that can compete with the degrees of blood pressure drop they achieve, so 30 millimeters of mercury systolic. 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure drops were there, but much less significant. I think that there's one of 2 interpretations of the data, 2 schools of thought. One is those earlier studies were confounded by the open label design, so patients knew they had denervation, doctors knew they had denervation, those following them up also knew they had denervation. And we've all learned over many years the power of placebo. Maybe people will change their behavior. Maybe the coordinators or the physicians who are checking the blood pressure are more inclined to believe lower blood pressures in those who were treated. These are been proven not in this study, but in many studies over the years, the effects of open label. And there's a good argument to say that really, with a properly well-conducted study like SYMPLICITY 3, that it shows the importance of trial design in assessing new device technology. The second argument was, hold on, Simplicity 3 was only negative because we don't know that we adequately achieved denervation. The argument is that these were people who are new to the procedure, and there's a learning curve, and there is no way of judging on the table whether a patient has had denervation. It's not like a stent. A stent, we all know, you see a narrowing, it opens up, we all know we've done a good job. There is no procedural readout for success with denervation. And there's a possibility that patients didn't achieve denervation. So that's where we stand right now. There's the school of thought that says, look, scientifically this really should work. Surgical sympathectomy works. We know the importance of sympathetic nervous chain in hypertension, and if you do adequate denervation, it's going to work. There's the other group saying, well, guys, you told us it was working already based on these huge clinical trials done in Europe and Australia. Now we've done the definitive study with the same device, the same technology, and it doesn't work. So we don't know where we stand. What I hope as a scientist is that we can assess the effect with newer devices. There are newer companies, and even the same company, Medtronic, that have newer devices that should really achieve more adequate denervation. And I think scientifically it would be nice to know from clinical trials whether proper or more aggressive denervation does have an effect on blood pressure.
So the feeling I got after listening to the late breaker studies and then discussing this with you is that really the Simplicity 3 results are more hypothesis generating, not the final nail in the coffin for renal denervation.
Yeah, I think a lot's going to depend on industry, whether they see a potential market for this, whether they believe that if you use better devices, more adequate denervation, whether that's going to make a difference, and whether they're prepared to have the outlay, because it's going to be a considerable cost to them to run a clinical trial, and whether patients and referring physicians are going to want to have their patients put into the trial, because I think it's unknown whether adequate sympathectomy will result in clinical response in some people. Also, whether there may be subgroups that we still don't know about that may benefit. For example, those with high sympathetic drive, those with heart failure who have sympathetic overactivation. Theoretically, these may benefit from sympathectomy. So those trials are underway. We know the Heart Failure Network is doing a trial of denervation in patients with heart failure, and we'll see whether the results will bear fruit there.
All right. Well, Dr. Gulati, thank you very much for the time and spending your expertise on the field with the fellows in training here. Please continue to follow us at youtube.com/fitsonthego.